Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the second day of Femtech Leaders 2021. It gives me great pleasure to be with you here today. We're going to jump straight into our first presentation, but before we do, just a reminder, we are live and therefore you can ask questions. Make sure to do that in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. So first up, we have a presentation from Sidley Austin, how to avoid regulatory and data privacy red flags that may deter investment. So Josefine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Becky. And thank you very much for having us here today. So we'll discuss some of the red flags from a regulatory and data privacy perspective that startups and companies looking for funding might want to consider as you're looking to speak to investors. Francesca, Blythe and I are both lawyers, senior associates at Sidley. It's a US headquartered law firm. I'm based in Brussels. Francesca is based in London. And we frequently work with our various teams on investment deals, mergers and acquisitions, funding. And so we thought that we would like to share with you some of the experience that we have so that you down the line can avoid some of the pitfalls that we might have seen coming up in our due diligence. We've also invited Blathnaid to join us here today. Blythe has been working in the medical device regulatory affairs industry for over 10 years. And so we'd invited her here to give some practical insight so that it's not just us talking about our theoretical and legal challenges that we see. She's got great experience in high-risk class 3 implantable devices across various jurisdictions, most recently in the Femtech field, where she worked in the clinical regulatory strategies department at AVA Women. For those of you who don't know, AVA, it's a fertility tracker device with an app, an algo, and a wearable, where she focused on the European and US markets. But Blythe, I'll give you the floor, and so you can say a few words about your experience with startups and getting investor funding.
Sure, Josephine, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so actually in my current role, I'm with Sonova as their Director of Quality and Regulatory Affairs, so a little bit of a step away from startup and investors, but I do have quite some experience, both with Ava, as you say, which is quite an established startup at this stage, but previously also with Coreflow Therapeutics, also based out of Switzerland, a cardiovascular device company, where I was quite involved on the investor relations and fundraising side of things. We raised 10 million or close to 10 million US dollars in seed funding, which took us all the way through to a first in man. So yeah, I'm happy to be here and to reminisce a little bit on some of my experiences sitting around the table with investors, and hoping that some of those experiences, as you say, can help others who are facing it. It's exciting, but it's also a little bit nerve-wracking, and yeah, happy also to hear your insights from both Francesca and you. So
thank you. And yeah, so today in this half an hour, we'll discuss how startups may think about some of the key regulatory and data privacy red flags, more specifically to avoid investors getting deterred from investing in your startups. We've sort of planned this session, and also generally when we do due diligence, and Francesca will speak a little bit about that, we understand that resources are limited in startups, and so do most investors, but we still think that there are some key items that should be addressed, or at least have been thought about when you seek funding. And so we'll try to discuss some of those areas during our presentation or our discussion here today. Francesca?
Yeah, thanks, Josephine. So I guess the first point is, what do we mean when we say legal due diligence? Like, what does it look like? So I would say conducting due diligence is typically one of the first steps taken by an investor. It will typically comprise a combination of financial, technical, and legal due diligence. In terms of the legal due diligence, so this is where we as lawyers are typically involved, and actually what the session will focus on. The purpose of the legal DD is to assess the potential risks of an investment by investigating sort of the obligations and the liabilities of the target company. And then the results of the diligence are intended to provide sort of information to the potential investor as to whether or not to proceed. It would also tell the investor how best to sort of, for example, ring fence or exclude certain risks, how to negotiate the contractual warranties, and then also to consider the amount of the investment. So the scope of the diligence or the legal due diligence is usually determined by the type of the business conducted by the company, and also the size of the potential investment. But what I would say is that for a target operating in the life sciences sector, you can almost guarantee that there will be an element of life sciences regulatory and privacy due diligence involved, amongst other areas as well. Typically, as a starting point, and I should flag that obviously all DD processes differ slightly, we would review the information provided up front by the target, as well as any sort of publicly available information. And then based on that, we would identify a list of questions that we would want answers to from the target. So from a privacy perspective, I'd be wanting to know sort of what data you have, what you're doing with it, where you're sending it. Have you had any sort of complaints from regulators or any breaches, etc.? There's also sometimes a call with the target where we would run through those questions and obtain clarification on certain points. And then based on that, we would prepare a report where we would typically identify any red flags, so any deal breakers. And then also, depending on the type of the investment and the instructions from our clients, the potential investor, we would propose certain remediation steps to address any issues identified. As I mentioned before, the results of the diligence will inform the drafting of the transaction documents, and in some cases, sort of whether or not the investor wants to proceed. So it is important that targets are prepared and as far as possible have all their ducks in a row in advance of the diligence phase. Just from a privacy perspective, and before I hand back to Josefine, I guess some of the red flags, which I will discuss in more detail a bit later on, they include sort of where there's been a cyber incident or even an ongoing cyber incident, and also where the data has not been collected lawfully. So going forward, there may be issues around the continued use and reliance on the data.
Yeah, and I can maybe also add to that, typically our reports do not come with a recommendation. So we don't recommend or do not recommend to our clients whether they should invest or not. What we do in our due diligence report is that we flag some of the potential risks that we see, and then it's really up to the investor to determine whether they, based on their own risk appetite, want to invest in the company. So from a regulatory healthcare perspective, as Francesca mentioned, we'll typically prepare a list of questions. We will do the online search whether there's anything that's come up with the company, and then we will ask sort of quite targeted questions. Again, from a startup perspective, we understand that most of the documents that we usually see in established companies, like inspection reports or even establishment licenses, is something that won't exist. But we will sort of have a quite tailored approach to that company or to that startup as we do our due diligence. I can maybe say a few words from a healthcare regulatory perspective, and then we'll elaborate a bit more and then hand over to Blythe. So from a regulatory healthcare perspective, some of the main things that we have seen, sort of the worst case scenarios, I guess, is wrongly classified products. So products that, for example, were sort of held out as being food supplements, turned out to be actually a drug, or products that might have been held out to be wellness products, that they in fact are medical devices. I have to say it's not often that we see that, but that's of course sort of the main red flags that we see in the investment side, if that's, because that will sort of determine the access to market or the timeline for access to market. But we'll get into that later. Blythe, from your perspective, any sort of experiences that you have with questions from investors at the due diligence stage of the investment?
Yeah, well, I guess from your perspective, it probably comes a little bit later that you're doing the due diligence. I was sort of on the front line trying to defend the first line strategies that we had put in place. And I mean, I think there's a number of questions you can always expect to be asked. And then some were unexpected and are ones that I have since come to expect from investors. So I think maybe as an early learning, I mean, always there will be a focus on obviously your regulatory strategy. You want to bring a kind of a top level regulatory strategy. And I think what I came to expect was that there often is this kind of cascade going from quality to regulatory down into clinical and then on to reimbursement. You know, it cascades very quickly. You go in kind of maybe expecting to present your kind of top level, as I say, regulatory strategy, and all of a sudden you're kind of knee deep in reimbursement discussions. So I think as a quality and regulatory representative, you kind of have to be prepared to discuss at least broadly how all of these items are interconnected. And I mean, we can discuss it in a little bit more detail. As I said, I think the expectation, or what I think is good to have in place, is already some sort of quality management system, because it's very tightly linked to your regulatory strategy, the milestones you intend to hit, and kind of keeps you on course in a lot of for a lot of the problems you can be faced with. I think in things that I was kind of not so expecting to see from investors, and which then I became familiar with, is that they're very opinionated, actually, in a lot of cases. And so, you know, you can go in with your strategy and, you know your product, you have a pretty good idea. I mean, obviously we hear stories of misclassification and whatnot, but in general, you know your product and you have a good feeling for how you're going to get it to market. But investors can be very opinionated on what those requirements might be. So I think you have to have kind of an open strategy. You have to be able to defend and justify why you have chosen the pathway you have chosen. But I think what I also learned was, especially with the more kind of seasoned investors or corporates, they have seen a lot. And so often the topics that they raise or the suggestions that they make are ones that you can really think about and not, you know, reject straight away in the discussion, but actually maybe consider too. So, you know, I think what I learned was going in up front with your really well-defined strategy is all well and good, but I mean, there may be other ways, and there may be more kind of valuable ways and things to learn. So yeah, that's maybe some of my top level learnings.
No, that's really helpful, I think. So starting maybe, Francesca, before getting to you and data privacy, sort of from a regulatory perspective, we thought that we would discuss a few of the items that we in particular sort of would flag from a legal perspective, and Blathnaid, you can speak to the practical aspects of this. And again, sort of with the really red flag items in mind. So again, in a normal due diligence, we would, you know, flag sort of low risk flags also, but for this purposes, just the key items that you want to be on the lookout for. Blythe, you already mentioned both the quality and sort of with an emphasis on flexibility. Do you want to start, just mention some of the main points that you would think that a startup would want to have sort of at least thought about, if not actually?
Yeah, and I think that's important to emphasize. I mean, when I say like having a quality system in place, it's not necessarily, as you say, when you're doing your due diligence, it's not necessarily that you're asking for their ISO 13485 certification, their last audit report, whatever, but it's having this approach to the business, I think. I think that really reassures investors. And of course, I mean, if you have the money and the resources, so be it. It is a good step to establish your quality management system. But as I say, it's more a thinking. So from my perspective, I think demonstrating that you have a QMS of some sorts in place, it really goes a long way, because also in terms of the kind of issues that you're going to deal with further down the line from a regulator, I think if you already have a QMS established early, you avoid a lot of the pitfalls, be that, you know, choosing wrong suppliers. I mean, maybe, you know, there are endless ways you can fall in this business, but I think having a QMS in place, as I say, gets you started on the right foot. Also, when you have a QMS in place, you're kind of more in this risk-based approach thinking, I feel. And so you're already considering different standards which might apply. You know, you're going from ISO 13485 to your risk management standard and thinking all along. I mean, again, it's very device dependent, but if you're looking at software development, you know, how have you considered the 62304 standard? To what extent have you, again, risk classified your device, and do you know really now the big difference in requirements between a class A to a class C? Again, for completely different devices, is your device implantable? Is it biocompatible? What vendor have you used when doing the biocompatibility? Like, are they reputable? And again, a QMS ensures this certain level of quality, that you will go out and look for somebody who has the right accreditations and the right certifications, so you don't end up, or an investor doesn't end up having to pay to redo these types of testing. Again, critical processes like sterilization, you know, are you considering the right standards there? So for me, that's why a QMS, or at least the approach to QMS thinking, is so important. And I think this is something that you can also sell somewhat to an investor, you know, that you're in this quality-driven frame of mind. This is also applicable then, of course, to FDA and the different guidances there. I mean, again, if we're thinking about algorithm or AI development, you know, are you considering their most recent thinkings on how you should develop this kind of data? So yeah, I mean, I think all of those things are things that I would be considering when presenting, based on the sorts of feedback I have been given from investors up to now.
Yeah, no, those are really helpful comments. I think from my experience also, it can be very difficult to sort of pull a QMS, whether it's certified or not, but pull a QMS system over an established system. So sometimes it's just easier to set up your processes and procedures and SOPs when you have the QMS sort of framework in mind. Otherwise, whether you get the ISO certification or not, it's just good to have that in mind.
Absolutely, sure. And I think it really has to be, you know, it's really product dependent. Like, you should only have a QMS that works for you, not that makes something more burdensome. I mean, just to have the certification brings nothing. It only brings value when you can work under it and when it works for you. So I think that's really important, that you establish a QMS for the product you have, commensurate with the amount of risk involved with the product, and also one that can kind of scale and grow with you across the different stages of the device development process. I think that's important, yeah.
Another thing that we in particular, and I think I already mentioned that from a legal perspective, is of course something that we look at. It's the classification. And so as I mentioned, you know, we always, not always, but, you know, we sometimes see these really bad examples of wrongly classified products. But from a legal perspective, that's where we're going to come in. So it's important to, you know, a classification can change as the product will sort of develop. But it's important from our perspective that there is some kind of strategy, and that there is an understanding within the company, within the startup, that this is sort of where you're aiming towards, and that there's an understanding of, you know, what does it require to put a food supplement on the market? What does it require to put a device on the market? The different risk classifications, and then within that, the underlying documentation that's required, clinical evidence, and so on. I know, Blathnaid, you come from, I mean, at EVA, you had to go through that process. Is there anything specific that you could share sort of from the early stages as you presented the device to your investors? What were some of the questions they had in terms of documentation?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting the same way that I say that people are opinionated on the pathway. I mean, one thing is the classification, right? And in some cases, it's just purely a wrong classification, but you can also have sort of borderline cases. And I think this maybe less so with AVA and more so with more novel, not that it's not novel, but novel implantables. I think, you know, I have had experience where, you know, it can be in your favor potentially to go fast to market with a 510K, for instance. Like, you can suggest that, yes, it is similar enough to have a 510K clearance, and so reduce a huge amount of the burden that an IDE or a PMA application will bring. But again, I think investors are, it depends on you know, what you want to discuss with the investor, but you might need to think more long-term, again, coming back to reimbursement, that actually, even if a 510K means you could commercialize your device sooner, in the long run, a PMA may be much more valuable if it gets you the high level clinical data that you need to ensure reimbursement. So I think there are lots of discussions to have around it. Of course, in terms of the clinical requirements in Europe, then the hot topic has been over the past few years, this increased scrutiny from an MDR perspective. And again, the question there may be of where to go to market first. I mean, if you can get a 510K through in the US sooner, while you gather your clinical data in Europe, that can also be interesting. So of course, this is all very top level and very much depends on the types of devices you're dealing with and the requirement for clinical data, also dependent on the types of claims you're going to want to make for your devices. So yeah, it's quite varied.
It depends.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Francesca, before handing over the floor to you to discuss some of the data privacy aspects of our due diligence, Blathnaid, I just had a question to you because you mentioned the reimbursement side, and just from a legal perspective, that's extremely complicated, and in Europe it's member state based. Like, what's the level of detail that an investor would expect you to know the market access in different member states or in the US?
Yeah, I think the reason I flag it is because I have been in so many meetings where it really ends up being this, and so you just don't want to be totally blindsided. I am no expert in reimbursement. And I mean, depending on the geography you're dealing with, of course, you have different requirements. I just know that, as I said, it cascades very quickly from quality, regulatory, clinical to reimbursement. And then you're sitting there and you're expected to have some sort of strategy. And so what I would suggest generally is that you at least have an idea of what it is to get a device reimbursed, whether you can even get your device reimbursed. I mean, obviously a big market is the United States, where they talk about these 3 pillars for reimbursement, where will your device even be covered in the first place, is coverage, whether there is a code that already exists, or whether you need to create a code, and then ultimately whether in the different clinical settings your device will be paid for. I would work with an external and have some sort of, I mean, it's money well spent up front, I would say, to do that initial investigation, so that you can at least speak to it to some degree when you're sitting there in front of an investor, and as I said, not be blindsided by it when you thought that your whole regulatory roadmap was very clear and pretty, and then you're sitting there talking about reimbursement, which you don't know too much about. So a word of warning.
Makes sense, thank you. So data privacy that everybody talks about and no one but Francesca knows anything about.
Yes, so thanks, Josefine. So I guess the first point I would make is that, at least from a European perspective, privacy compliance and sort of privacy diligence has become sort of increasingly important since 2018. So that's when the new European privacy law came into force, called the GDPR, and primarily because of the fines associated with the GDPR for non-compliance. So now investors are typically much more focused on data privacy compliance, partly because there are scenarios where an investor could potentially be considered responsible for any pre-investment breaches by the target, or at least may find themselves in a position sort of post-close where they're having to pick up the costs for dealing with those breaches or for addressing gaps in privacy compliance. So it is, or it can be, very important, and we've certainly seen instances where investors have pulled out potential investments where the privacy compliance has been identified as a red flag, or at least where the size of the investment has been reduced. So I would also flag that it is particularly important in cases where there is a heavy reliance on the use of personal data, in particular sensitive data like health data, and or where novel technologies are being used. So essentially, I guess, Femtech companies. In terms of sort of how a company with limited resources, or at least limited resources to spend on privacy compliance, what sort of steps they should take to sort of avoid those situations. The GDPR has a sort of whole realm of obligations, but there are sort of some key areas that I would say should be a focal point. The first would be this concept of what's called privacy by design. So a very broad concept, somewhat fluffy, I guess, but essentially it's the requirement that companies integrate data protection compliance into their sort of business practices. from the design stage throughout the life cycle. So it will mean different things to different companies. But I guess key is to ensure that when you are developing the product or the service, whether it's a device, an app, whatever it may be, that you have considered the privacy implications from the outset. And then the product or service is designed and implemented accordingly. So again, I guess privacy enhancing settings should be set as a default. In practice, it means sort of thinking about what technical measures you're going to implement to safeguard the data, ensuring that you only collect what you actually need. So don't collect data just in case it may be useful going forward. You need to have a sort of a minimum, you collect the minimum data you need. And then also looking at sort of what guidelines you can put in place around sort of the collection and the sharing of the data. So if you're granting access to third parties to the data, take steps to ensure that those third parties are reliable, that they also have policies and procedures and practices, etc. in place, not least because, I mean, there's a potential that you could be held liable, for example, for any breaches that that third party may suffer. And at least from a reputational perspective, it will be you that sort of bears the brunt of that. And I guess, I mean, key is just, take a proactive approach, anticipate the privacy issues and the risks before they happen, rather than having to deal with them after the fact, I guess. Kind of linked to that concept of privacy by design is the concept of information security. So no company wants to be in a position to have to disclose, historic details of historic or even ongoing breaches to potential investors. And I mean, we've actually seen instances where there's an incident that happens right in the middle of a diligence phase, and it is far from ideal. However, sometimes it is unavoidable. So key is therefore to take steps to reduce the chance of there being an incident. And then in the event there is one, having processes in place to ensure that those incidents can be contained and remediated efficiently. The GDPR isn't prescriptive about sort of what technical measures you need to put in place. It acknowledges there's no sort of one size fits all approach. But what I would say is be conscious that many of your companies, if not all of your companies, will likely be handling health data, which is by its nature sensitive and therefore requires an enhanced level of security. You'll also want to consider specific information security requirements under any sort of sector-specific regulations, so medical devices regulation, things like that. And you'll, as I mentioned before, you'll want to consider what information security measures your third parties have implemented. So where possible, only choose sort of reputable vendors with strong information security practices. Another key point to consider is international transfers. I know we are running out of time, so I won't go into much detail here, but just be aware that there are restrictions on the transfer of personal data from Europe to countries outside of Europe, and there are certain safeguards that you'd want to put in place before doing that. Many of the larger sophisticated vendors will have sort of these standard form agreements and assessments as part of their contract package, but just be alert to these requirements because it is a hot topic from a privacy perspective at the moment. And then very quickly, finally, the lawful collection and use of the data. So essentially, you need to establish what's called a legal basis to use the data. How often what we're seeing when carrying out due diligences are instances where companies have collected the data and subsequently using the data without identifying an appropriate legal basis. That often becomes more problematic when we're talking about sensitive data like health data. And when this is the case, the value of the data can be compromised because it's often very difficult to retrospectively address the lawfulness of the processing. So this will then have implications for the ongoing use and reliance on the data, including potentially, in the context of any submissions you're making to regulatory authorities in reliance on the data. So it is something that needs to be determined at the outset. You'll also want to consider what information you're giving individuals about how you're using their data, because again, that will dictate largely what you can use the data for. So also a key consideration.
Thank you so much. I had so many questions, but I know we're coming out of time. So maybe just the last 30 seconds, I'll just summarize sort of the 3 key aspects that we discussed. So to your point, Blathnaid, I think the first key takeaway is that you should be assertive but flexible in your strategy when you speak to investors. The second item to be on the lookout for is your potential access to market, and assess your different pathways there. You might not necessarily need the full strategy, but at least you need to understand. And then Francesca, picking up on what you said, I guess the third takeaway is to make sure that you take the necessary steps to protect your data and ensure its value. So make sure that it's collected lawfully. So I think we're running out of time, and Becky, we promised to give you back the microphone. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Josefine. And yes, I mean, lots of questions, I'm sure, and you could have continued for, at least another 30 minutes, but we'll have to end it there. But thank you for such an informative presentation. I think it's clear that you definitely need to seek the advice of experts if you've got any questions. So with that in mind, I do encourage you to reach out to Francesca, Josefine, etc., either on platform or off. I'm sure they'll be happy to sort of, take those queries via LinkedIn or email. That's obviously, why you speak to the experts. But thank you so much for such an informative presentation. We've got a bit of a break now for a couple of hours, but we'll be back here at 2 o'clock BST with a very simple panel, key success factors in fundraising. So if you want some cash, I mean, who doesn't, then that's definitely a panel to tune in for. But until then, I'll see you later.